The battle came, and all hell followed it. The nauseating smell irritated his senses despite his gas mask, and the savage roars of the orcs even more so. However, he was used to it. They all were. The orc horde had rampaged through a dozen smaller settlements already, dragging their army of 1,000,000 sacks of green flesh across the Emperor's domain. No more. For hours now, the basilisk batteries had hammered their ranks, blasting away soldiers and machines alike. Even still, the greenskins pushed forward, carried only by their primitive nature. Landmines answered their war cries, and then volleys of heavy bolter fire from the entrenched Kriegsmen. They fell by their dozens, hundreds even, yet they still persisted. The young Kriegsmen could, on some level, respect this. Their ferocity and stubbornness to keep fighting was not too dissimilar to the Kriegsman mentality, alien and vile though it was. "Form a line!" the captain yelled as he drew his sword. "Affix bayonets! Repel!" 1491 grabbed his bayonet, and right after he readied his las rifle, he checked his left breast pocket. It was still there, thank the Emperor. Its pink petals still contrasted his dark uniform. He was almost lost in a trance when the captain blew his whistle and the company ascended up the ladders. Las fire and sharpened steel met orc flesh in a mess of gore and screaming. He knew that orcs, despite their barbaric nature, were monsters on the battlefield, monsters that should never be underestimated. He fired his rifle at one of the orcs, melting his face off. Another several shots tore another orc's throat out. While he fired, he instinctively covered his left breast pocket with his firing arm. He felt something he had never felt before. He was afraid. He needed to protect it. "Focus," he kept telling himself. "Focus!" In the corner of his eye, he saw his brothers overwhelm an orc with numbers and pierce his flesh with the bayonets. A Kriegsman to his left stood alone, and for good reason. The flamer in his hands spat sizzling promethium that burned several of the greenskins to ash. Both sides were dying. Both sides enjoyed it. But while one considered it sport, the other thought of it as duty. But 1491 was not ready to die. There was still so much he could do for the Emperor. But these thoughts began to sink as large silhouettes walked through the smoke. More orcs, but these orcs were bigger, with more armor and heavier weapons. They opened fire and the crude lead shells tore through the company's ranks. The flame trooper managed to burn one of them. But then another grabbed him by his head, lifted him up, and crushed his head into a fine pulp. The orc then threw his dead body at the young Kriegsman, and they both fell back into the trench. Moments passed as he tried to gather himself, his brother's headless corpse pinning him down. Pushing his fallen brother-in-arms aside, he stood back up and checked his left breast pocket. It was empty. It was empty. No, where is it? Where did it go? He frantically climbed back up the ladder. The carnage around him intensified. More orcs were showing up, and the other companies came for support. Strangely, he did not care about that. He ignored everything and looked for the flower. Then he saw it, lying in the ash and mud, its bright petals now dark and dirty. But before he could get to it, a group of orcs in Gretchen ran over it, crushing it and tearing it apart. A deep and dark rage he thought he could never feel boiled up inside him. Glancing to his right, he saw his fallen brother's flamer. He dove for it and the greenskins ran after him. A mistake they wouldn't live to regret, as 1491 burned them all to a crisp. Tossing the flamer aside, he ran to the flower. He dug below the mud and ash. He dug, and he dug, and he dug. And as he did, a small cry began escaping his eyes and lips. "Please," he spoke quietly. "Please don't die. Please don't die." He prayed to the Emperor. He prayed and hoped that he would hear him, an insignificant soul on a backwater world, and answer his cries. And just as he began to lose hope, he saw a small hint of light in the ash and the mud. Below the muddied and torn remnants of the flower was a single petal. It was small and more pink and white, but it lived. It lived. He held it in his bloody hands as he stood back up and smiled behind his mask. This moment, however, was short-lived, as another wave of greenskins roared in the distance. He put the petal into one of his pouches, gently, and picked up the flamer once again. The other companies, his brothers, stood beside him, all armed, all ready. The banner of Krieg stood proud in the wind, and the Imperium's flag rose even higher. None of them flinched as the orcs arrived. None dared look away. No one dared to break their oath. "For Krieg!" the colonel shouted at the top of his lungs, nearly shattering his vocal cords. "For the Emperor!" Every single one of the men yelled back in unison as they charged at the enemies of man.